Nau mai, haere mai, piki mai, kake mai, kia ora e tiwi, and welcome to 30 with me, Guyon Espiner. We do 30 minutes with one guest and no cuts, so what we record is what you get. Well, for most of us, AI exploded into our worlds in late 2022 with the release of ChatGPT by the company OpenAI. But by then, Karen Hao had been following OpenAI and its leader Sam Altman for many years. In 2019, she was the first journalist to gain extensive access to the company and to write its first profile. And last year, she published the book Empire of AI, Inside the Reckless Race for Total Domination. Now, she's chosen the word empire carefully, drawing an explicit parallel with European colonialism, extraction, subjugation, thirst for power and money, with a civilizing mission used to justify it. So, are we building AI that will help us cure cancer, solve climate change and make our lives easier? Or are we sitting back and allowing power and wealth to be concentrated in the hands of a small Silicon Valley elite? Let's start the clock. 30 minutes with Karen Hao. Karen Hao, welcome to 30.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let's start with what's happening right now, because we are in the midst of an arms race on AI, and we're seeing that on the trillions being poured into some of these companies. SpaceX has just done its IPO. We've got OpenAI and Anthropic to follow soon. Do you think with these trillions going into these AI companies that we are going to see giant leaps in the tech and in the way that it alters our lives?
So one of the things that I think is important context to understand in the AI conversation in general is that AI is a category of vastly different technologies. I often like to use the analogy that AI is like the word transportation. Transportation can refer to anything from bicycles to rockets. And these AI companies, the ones that you named, xAI, as merged with SpaceX, OpenAI, Anthropic, they're all engaging in what I consider to be the rockets of AI development. They are advancing AI through a brute force approach where they are trying to pump ever more amounts of data into these algorithms and train them on ever larger supercomputers, the largest supercomputers that humanity has ever seen. And so have we seen lots of dividends with this particular approach in the last few years with the emergence of ChatGPT and with other types of commercial generative AI products? Yes. But is this actually the approach that would lead us to some of the things that these executives promise us, like climate change, better healthcare, and so on and so forth? My critique of this type of AI development approach is that there's extraordinary cost, and actually we won't get these kinds of benefits on the other end. That would come from other types of AI technologies, which I call the bicycles of AI.
Yeah, that's a really interesting analogy. So why do you think they are taking this brute force scale approach? Like, what is motivating that?
It really goes back to what you were saying, which is that they are in a cutthroat competition, a race with one another. And one of the things that these companies identified early on is that when you're trying to invest in fundamental AI research to get breakthroughs to advance AI, not through brute force, this is a very difficult process. You can't guarantee that you're going to get to the next leap of AI development in a particular amount of time. And when your competitor is doing this brute force approach to get those dividends within just a few months, then you end up doing the same thing as well, because you know that if you pour more data and you use larger supercomputers, generally speaking, there has been evidence over the past few years that it does help you gain access to more certain types of capabilities. And they also have recognized that when it comes to generative AI, at least initially, they believe that there would be an enormous amount of consumer and commercialization potential because people really like using chatbots. People really like generating images, generating videos. And so this brute force approach, what it gives you is more and more hyper realistic chatbot-like systems and video generation systems. And so it's along this path as well of productization and making their companies ever more popular among consumers. Of course, we're starting to see that their business plan is in fact falling apart. They haven't been able to monetize this approach, but that was the initial hypothesis that set them down on this path.
Interesting. We'll circle back later to how you think it might impact the job market. But I just wanted to talk about OpenAI because your book focuses on Sam Altman's company. I mean, the initial pitch, wasn't it, was for this safety-conscious, non-profit, building AI for the benefit of humanity. To what extent has he lived up to those values?
So that was, of course, the stated mission. But through the process of reporting on this company for many years, I've realized that there was an unspoken mission, or at least unspoken to the public, that actually was the dominant guiding force of how the company organized itself. And it was to be the dominant AI lab in the world, to beat all other AI labs and be the number one advancer of this technology. And so in the beginning, they created a nonprofit and had this mission-driven orientation, at least publicly, in part because the bottleneck for becoming the number one lab as a laggard in the space, because Google had already been investing in this technology for years, was to focus on recruiting talent through a sense of purpose. And so if you think about at the time when OpenAI was starting, Google had enormous amounts of money. OpenAI simply would not have been able to compete on salaries to try and poach that talent away. But they could say, do you want to work for a faceless corporation, or do you want to work for a mission-driven nonprofit that's trying to benefit all of humanity? And this is exactly what led some of the top scientists that were core to the beginning of this nonprofit endeavor to jump away from Google or to forego an offer from Google and join OpenAI. But once they overcame that talent bottleneck, and they simply needed to just play a money game, build ever larger supercomputers that are very, very expensive in order to brute force your way to more advancement, then it starts becoming, let's create a for-profit, let's raise an extraordinary amount of money to ensure that we continue to win. And so if we try to measure OpenAI against the stated mission from the beginning, no, I don't think that they've lived up to that promise. But if we measure them against what they were actually driving towards, I think they've been very successful on that particular benchmark.
You favour this empire framing, obviously, in your book. You see what these companies sort of seizing precious resources to feed the AI, including the work of artists, writers. They need the resources of energy and water to run these data centres. So is that why you chose that framing?
That's exactly right. There are four different parallels that I find incredibly striking between what I call the empires of AI and the empires of old. One of them is this laying claim to resources that are not their own, as you mentioned. Another one is the extraordinary amount of labor exploitation that goes into these technologies. And that is, a core feature of empire building is that you're able to accrue value so quickly because you're not actually proportionally distributing that value to the people who helped you generate it. And the third thing is actually information control. So empires typically are able to control the flow of information, control knowledge production, such that you can only access the knowledge, the science, the research that actually expands the empire rather than undermines it. And we've seen in the AI industry over the last 10 years that they've begun to bankroll most of the AI researchers in the world. And you could imagine if most of the climate scientists in the world were bankrolled by fossil fuel companies, we absolutely wouldn't get a clear picture of the climate crisis. And in the same way, we actually have a very distorted picture of the limitations and capabilities of these AI technologies that tells a story that favors what these companies are doing and justifies why they should continue doing it. And the last parallel you mentioned in your intro is this civilizing mission, this idea that they're ultimately doing all of this for the benefit of all of humanity. And if they don't do it, they are in this arms race against an evil empire that threatens to descend humanity into hell.
And that's China, presumably. Is that the evil enemy as they see it? Well, if we don't do it, they will.
Yeah, so in the early days, interestingly, for OpenAI, they actually framed Google as the evil empire because Google was the dominant player in AI. But then, of course, as the industry matured, as there became a lot more competitors, and as they started needing to get government, the US government, to enable more of their growth, then yes, the evil empire became China because China is the best way to get the US government to not regulate these companies and, in fact, to enable their aggressive expansion and dominance.
Okay, the holy grail for these companies, and it was stated by Sam Altman with OpenAI, was for AGI, or artificial general intelligence. I know it's a bit of a slippery definition about what even this concept is. I mean, I take it to mean that it's smarter than humans. And when I'm playing around with Claude, especially Fable 5, we got restricted on that recently here in New Zealand. We can talk a little bit about that later. But how do you see artificial general intelligence? Are we there yet? Are we going to get there? What is your assessment on that?
So the challenge with the term artificial general intelligence is exactly what you identified, which is people generally understand it to mean that it's some kind of theoretical AI system that has a relatively stronger capability to what we call intelligence than humans. But the problem is we don't have any scientific consensus around what human intelligence is. And so this is a definition that has no measurability. You can't actually measure whether or not we've reached the goal because no one agrees on where the goalposts are. And so what I have realized over time in covering these companies is that they use this vagueness very much to their advantage. They will define and redefine AGI to be whatever they need it to be and set the goalposts wherever they essentially need to go. So OpenAI has used, to my account, at least 4 different definitions of AGI. One on their website is highly autonomous systems that outperform humans in most economically valuable work. So this is a labor automating definition. They're saying explicitly here that they're going after the most high paying jobs. They, in their contract with Microsoft, they defined AGI as a system that will achieve $100 billion of revenue. So this is a financial definition, which is quite different from the labor automating definition, because you could achieve revenue in ways other than labor automation. And then when Sam Altman is in front of Congress, he's saying that AGI is a system that's going to solve climate change, cure cancer. So that's a societal benefits definition. And finally, when OpenAI is trying to sell their product to consumers, they say it's a digital super assistant that's going to help you check your emails, manage your calendar. And so that's more of like a consumer product definition. So these are all clearly very, very vastly different definitions that are really just defined based on what the company is trying to motivate their audience to do. Of course, with Congress, they're trying to motivate Congress to not regulate the company. With the consumers, they're trying to motivate the consumers to buy their product. So it's just an incoherent picture. And so, yeah, are we going towards AGI? I don't know. But more beyond that, I think it's really important to say that generally trying to replicate humans is a fundamentally anti-human goal. This is one of the things that I think we should be deeply questioning about the way that Silicon Valley ultimately is trying to pursue AI development, is they have explicitly said in many of these definitions that they are trying to make humans redundant. And that's not the point of technology development, and has never been the point of technology development. Technology is meant to serve people, not serve people up to technology. And so there's an even more fundamental question that we should be scrutinizing here of should we be allowing this industry to define this vague goalpost in that general direction at all?
Because they've been incredibly successful at lobbying not to have regulation in the United States. I mean, I did see a recent sort of shifting of the tide a little bit in that Anthropic was told not to give Mythos or Fable 5, which seems to be the sort of consumer one with guardrails on it. So the US has regulated on that. But previously, they didn't want to touch any of these big tech players in AI, did they? So how have they achieved that?
So I think Anthropic's a really unique case in that, um, you know, uh, OpenAI and Anthropic is a very deeply personal rival with OpenAI, and the reason is because the former executives or sorry, the executives of Anthropic were former executives of OpenAI. So they actually left OpenAI because they didn't trust Sam Altman and they felt that they would be better off just starting their own company. And so their approach to OpenAI is very, very similar. They also take this brute force support approach. They're scaling their technologies with ever more data, ever larger supercomputers. And yet, they have this very intense personal vendetta with each other. And so you can see that this has played out a lot in OpenAI's favor and against Anthropic when it comes to the US government because Sam Altman is someone who is very politically savvy. He's good at cozying up with people in power. And early on, when Trump came back into power, Altman was there by his side and in closed door meetings and having executives visit him in Mar-a-Lago and so on and so forth in order to establish that really strong connection with the Trump administration. Anthropic took the exact opposite approach, in part because of this vendetta. They wanted to really define themselves as not cozying up to power and not being like Sam Altman. And so over time, what we've seen is this spat that has been ongoing between the US government and with Anthropic that exploded very spectacularly when Anthropic and the Department of War went head to head over whether or not the Department of War was allowed to use Anthropic's technologies in certain ways involving their military operations. And so we've seen some reporting come out over the weekend that there's a lot of speculation right now, and it's very difficult to understand exactly why the US government decided to put export controls on the Fable model. But some of the reporting suggests that it was because the US government was just very, very concerned. And other reporting has suggested that it's because the US government has continued to be really angry at Anthropic for what it did with the Department of War. And unfortunately, we live in a day and age right now where there's this spat between two entities that are both incredibly irresponsible actors right now. And so this is what we see. The effect of their machinations is this very chaotic and confusing policy and regulation that is poorly applied.
What strikes me too about this industry is when, in usual circumstances, companies have a product that could be harmful to its users, they try to keep that secret. I'm thinking of the 7 big tobacco bosses who swore that nicotine is not addictive. Yet these guys are saying, hey, look, our models could bring down mission critical infrastructure, or if we build this, everyone dies, or whatever. What do you think is going on there? Are they hyping it to some degree, or are they genuinely signaling some of the downsides of these products?
Yeah, so this is definitely a very unique feature of the AI industry, and it absolutely is another form of hype. The reason why this kind of hype has traditionally been so effective, I talk in my book about one particular example where Sam Altman goes up in front of Congress and he says, "You should regulate us." But this is during the Biden administration when the Biden administration was positioning itself to crack down on the tech industry. So Altman recognizes that it would play well with the Biden administration to, humble himself in front of Congress and say, you should regulate us. But then what he says is, you should regulate us on issues that include the potential extrication of our AI models out of data centers. So what he was saying is you should regulate us on the potential of our AI systems to go rogue and for us to lose control of these AI models. This is a very science fiction scenario. There are certain people within the AI industry that genuinely believe this, but they recognize that it's just a belief. There's no actual scientific evidence to back this kind of scenario. But what does it do in this instance? Congress suddenly thinks, oh, this industry is really responsible. They want to be regulated. And they start focusing on a totally fictitious problem. And what Altman didn't mention in that particular hearing was copyright infringement, data privacy issues, labor exploitation, environmental fallout, public health crisis, all of the other real world concrete problems that are happening right now, the harms of their industries. He didn't once mention the mental health impacts, the erosion of critical thinking. So this is how the AI industry kind of manipulates the public and manipulates policymakers to focus on the wrong problem so that they get brownie points for cautioning people about the downsides of their technology, but actually it's just shifting the focus away from the real downsides.
Fascinating. You mentioned there, that the small possibility that AI goes rogue, and some people believe that is a realistic scenario, and they have their P-doom, which would sort of necessitate what you think the chances of the robots wiping us all out. In that sort of scenario, they want to come here, don't they? They want to come to New Zealand. You write in your book that Sam Altman said in the event of a doomsday scenario, he planned to escape to New Zealand with his close friend and mentor, the billionaire investor Peter Thiel, who actually is a New Zealand citizen.
That's right. Yeah. One of the things that Naomi Klein has this incredible phrase for describing these tech personalities and also other types of doomsdayers. She calls it end times fascism. This idea that these people are accelerating, they somehow weirdly recognize that what they are doing is accelerating a quote unquote doomsday scenario, at least within their frame, right? Like they're actively participating in something that within their belief system could potentially lead to total chaos and destruction of Earth or of the human race. And yet they do it anyway and then build a bunker on the side as sort of the backup plan for themselves. And this is, I think a really, really critical observation for understanding the ideologies of these people and why it's so dangerous and toxic is they don't actually care about the potential total destruction as long as they will be okay at the other end. So they're willing to gamble the fate of Earth, the fate of humanity in order to achieve like their billionaire dreams because they would not be the ones suffering the brunt of it if things go badly.
That'd be in New Zealand. I wanted to touch on some of the ethical things because this wasn't something I knew about until I read your book about these content moderators, often in countries like Kenya, I think, who are being paid very little, and they're sort of filtering sexual abuse material or graphic violent content effectively for Western consumers. Can you lay some of that out for us? I mean, is that still happening from these AI companies? Are they still doing that?
They're absolutely still doing that. So what this refers to is there's this common myth within the AI industry that they try to perpetuate among consumers that their systems are completely autonomous and they sort of emerge from their own smarts and suddenly become able to do all of these capable things. But every single thing that an AI system is able to do, they can do because a human trained them or thousands of humans trained them to do that. So the fact that ChatGPT can chat is because there were thousands of workers, extremely poorly paid, extremely exploited all around the world that were literally transcribing examples of dialogue into like a Word document and then feeding it to the AI model and saying, this is how humans converse with one another. Person A talks, person B responds, person A responds again, and so on and so forth. And then once the model was trained on that, then there were more people that would upvote and downvote when the model responded based on whether they thought that the model was being engaging, helpful, and so on. And this work is essential to actually creating the model itself. And I talk then about the workers who downstream of that are also involved in the content moderation to make sure that these models don't then spew really harmful things at users. Because when you think about what these models are trained on, they're trained on Reddit forums and social media posts and other things that can contain a lot of toxicity and some of the worst parts of humanity. And those content moderators suffer the same psychological impacts of content moderators of the social media era, where they really became deeply traumatized. Some of them developed post-traumatic stress disorder. Their families unraveled, and they were paid, roughly $2 an hour for this kind of work that left them completely a shell of a human. Since the publication of my book, what we have seen is this work has become even more popular because one of the challenges is that these companies, in their brute force approach to try and get more and more capabilities, they are now their technologies are largely commoditized because they're not actually engaging in real innovation to differentiate their products. They're simply just shoving more data into their products and training them on larger computers. And so they try to differentiate themselves now with the human labor and what they're asking these human workers to do. So they're asking, now lawyers and scientists and doctors to do some of the training of these models, to try and get these models to imitate the functions of these different categories of work. And that also means there's a much greater expanded category of content moderation that needs to happen.
Yes.
And so
I heard also, I can't remember where I read it recently, that journalists were getting employed to teach them how to do journalism, presumably. But in all these cases, you're kind of signing up to spell the end of your industry at that point, aren't you?
There's an enormous amount of journalists that are being hired to do various types of work. Some of it is related to journalism. Some of it is just, hiring journalists because they're good communicators and good writers, and that is useful for any kind of task. I would caution in reinforcing this narrative, though, that ultimately these models will successfully automate away all work because of this kind of labor. What we've actually seen is that this work is so poorly orchestrated and the workers are so badly exploited that the ability of the AI companies to actually absorb the expertise and knowledge of these workers is actually pretty minimal. So I have interviewed quite a lot of workers since the publication of my book to look at the process of how data annotation is happening now, and it's happening in much more developed context now. I talked in my book about workers in Kenya and Colombia, and now it's data annotation is the fourth fastest growing job in the US. So we're talking about college grads, master's students, PhD grads, and professionals with years of experience. And what they've told me is that you would think that based on just the roster of people that this industry is gathering up to do this data annotation and content moderation, that somehow it would be then correlated with the models ultimately being able to do all of this work, all knowledge work eventually. But they emphasize, every single interview, the workers emphasized the data annotation is barely touching the surface of my actual knowledge and actual expertise. And the coordination that the companies are engaged in is just so poorly designed, so poorly managed, that often it's incorrect knowledge and incorrect expertise that is actually getting fed into these models.
I just wanted to spend the last 3 or 4 minutes that we've got talking about some of the backlash. You've got this fascinating thing called the resist list that you've set up. And it strikes me that from what I've read that Gen Z in America are getting pretty nervous and anxious about AI. But talk us through some of the things on the resist list, including this nightshade tool, I'd not heard of this, that transforms images into sort of poison samples, if you like, and so the model's training on them will pick this up and learn unpredictable behaviours or something. I'm fascinated in that one and some of the other key things that you might see if humanity represents a real backlash against what we're seeing.
Yeah, so one of the things that has happened in the past year that's been really extraordinary is the complete shift in the global public conversation around AI. I think when I was writing the book just 2 years ago, the hype was unbelievable. Everyone thought that this was, the next revolution was going to bring benefit to everyone. And what's happened is reality has hit. And now many, many people around the world are realizing that they're actually not being benefited by this tool at all. And in fact, in many cases are being exploited by either the industry in the course of developing this technology or by the technology once it's deployed. And so in the US, for example, there's been this dramatic shift where previously there was around 70-ish% of Americans who believed that AI would be beneficial. And now 80% of Americans are concerned and do not think that AI is on the right path. And so we have seen all of these different movements break out around the world to push back against the way that this technology is being developed, to push back against Silicon Valley's ideologies. And so I did this project called the AI Resist List with a group of journalists, critical scholars, and AI researchers, where we sought to document some of these resistance movements around the world to just see what are the actions that people are taking, and also to push back against another myth that the AI industry perpetuates, that this is somehow inevitable. What we've shown through the AI Resist List and around 30 different examples from all around the world of people actually reclaiming their agency and successfully pushing back is that their actions are in fact holding the AI industry accountable, and it is slowing down and changing the way that the AI industry actually develops its technology. So the Nightshade tool is one of my favorite examples. It's this tool that was developed by a professor at the University of Chicago named Ben Zhao. And this is a tool that when artists and writers, artists and creatives, visual artists, when they need to post their work online because they need to have their portfolio online, they're very vulnerable to then getting their work scraped to be trained in these image generators, and then it automates away a lot of their job opportunities. And so Ben Zhao created Nightshade, where they can glaze their images so that it doesn't look like the image has changed, at least to the human eye. But when an AI model then trains on the work without the artist's consent, it totally breaks down the image generator. And so this is a way to prevent the AI industry from using non-consentful, data for their training.
Yeah, that's a fascinating element of that. Thank you so much for your time, Karen, and congratulations on your book. Really appreciate your time on 30. That was 30 Minutes with Karen Hao. This is 30 with me, Guyon Espiner, and we'll catch you next time.